I see the participants. I'm recording.
Yeah,
we hear all of them.
Ah, there we go. They're enjoying the conversation.
We can hear all of you. Perfect. All right. Good. Then I guess I did somehow manage to.
And how many people are going to be attending?
Looks like we've got 12 of us on right now. And I told our group we're going to put I'll get this up on YouTube. We have a couple of other people who are still trying to get on, so maybe we'll give it a minute. And then Shada, you can do your introduction.
Okay.
But I'm going to put this up on YouTube as soon as possible too, so you guys can share this with whatever networks you want. It'll be up on our account, and then we'll be posting it in the group for participants to watch at a later time, and we'll put it in the focus groups.
Perfect.
All right. So Shada, if you want to take it away with the introductions, I'm going to mute myself and turn to my attention to the AV situation back here.
Okay, welcome everyone. So we are super fortunate today because our speaker is not only a professor of political science at Northwestern University, but also an international expert in refugees and forced migration studies. Her work focuses on the rights and processes of refugee protection and the role of law in settlement and inclusion in host societies. She has also founded and directed the Northwestern Center for Forced Migration Studies, done extensive field research in East Africa, Germany, and the US, and has published a range of works relating to refugee and asylum law. She also recently released a book called Adjudicating Refugee and Asylum Status, the Role of Witness, Expertise, and Testimony, and in 2018 founded a public charity called Compass that works to design effective approaches that support the attainment and long-term financial stability for refugees and asylees in our communities. So without further ado, I want to thank you so much for being here today, and I would like to introduce Galya Ben-Arieh.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shada, and thank you, Maddie and Mashoud and Insight Collaborative. I'm really excited to work with this group. I love mentoring, and now that I even heard more about this program, I'm even more excited to be part of it. So I'm going to share my screen. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation that's most likely too long, but I think, the idea is that it could introduce you to the sector and to the paradigm shifts. So what I know you're thinking about in this first week is refugee protection, paradigm shifts, and why they matter. So we're going to start today thinking about what is the post-World War II paradigm. And I loved that your directors of your program here, I read the 3-pager, and it was terrific that they said, in order to know where you want to go, it's important to know where you've been. And so I'm going to spend a little bit of time right now just thinking about what was the World War II paradigm. And the World War II paradigm is really based in the problem of the time. And the problem at that time, although there's always been movement of people, there's always been movement of people because of climate-based displacement, all different kinds of displacement. So people have always been on the move. But in the post-World War II era, what they were trying to solve had something to do with statelessness and displaced persons. And so let's take a moment and think about this. So at that time period, the world we had come from was one of empires, and then there was the world of colonial world. So there was empires, and then there was colonization. And so the post-World War II refugee regime was built really in a time, it came out of the problematic of state building and exile. So refugees are people who are stateless and displaced because they don't belong in any state. So this happens because there was an unmixing of populations. So as empires, like the Ottoman Empire and the other empires moved on to a system of nation states, and you had colonial states then trying to, colonial states colonizing Africa and India and all sorts of other areas, you had a desire, starting to create the nation state system. And so in the creation of nation states, you start to see massive displacement because you had war and genocide. For example, in Europe at the Holocaust, you had post-colonial partitions. After the colonial powers left, you had the partition of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Israel and Jordan, and the creation of, with Palestinians, massive displacement of Palestinians. In Africa, you have Zaire, creation of Zaire and Rwanda, and those were all borders that were set up through partitions that didn't match the people that were in them. So this led to massive displacements. The photos on the slide show the picture at the top of people fleeing Nazi Germany, Jews who are fleeing, who didn't perish in the Holocaust, but who are displaced. Down below, you have people in this corner here. These are Palestinians fleeing in the creation and the partition of the state of Israel. Here you have the partition of India and Pakistan. And here you have the partition of the Middle East and Jews who, from different Arab countries who needed to leave, were told to leave and unmix and come to the creation of the state of Israel. So at the same time period, you have the birth of human rights. So that's a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt, who at the time period, the concept was if everyone just got into their correct nation state, the world would see no more war. They thought the problem is that there were different ethnicities and different races and different nationalities and different religions. And if everyone just got into homogeneous nation states, that we would live in a world of peace. So part of this came with this promise of human rights. And so in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was born. And in that, there's Article 13, which said that everyone has a right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. And Article 14, which said that everyone has a right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum for persecution. The problem was there was no state that would agree to another article that would say that every state must let people in. So this human rights, the birth of human rights, also created the dilemma that you're allowed to leave and you're allowed to enjoy asylum, but you don't really have a right to it. At the same time, you had the creation of the International Covenants of Human Rights that became effective in 1966. There's one for civil and political rights and one for economic, social, and cultural rights. So let's now think, though, about the creation of human rights and then this problem of the massive statelessness and displaced people that are in the world. Hannah Arendt was one of those, and she's a famous philosopher. If you haven't read her, you should. So she was forced to flee Nazi Germany. And she said, a refugee used to be a person driven to seek refuge because of some act committed or some political opinion held. So let's pause there a moment. So it was once upon a time that refugee had a very distinct term. It was reserved for people who were elites, who it was like a king, you were the enemy of the king and you fled, or you were part of an outgoing regime. And so it was a very kind of elite concept of you were a political, you were the outgoing regime and you needed asylum in some country. But now we had a new phenomenon in post-World War II, and Hannah Arendt captures this. She said, we committed no acts, meaning nothing political, and most of us never dreamt of having any radical opinion. With us, the meaning of the term refugee has changed. Now refugees are those of us who have been so unfortunate as to arrive in a new country without means and have to be helped by refugee committees. So that's the new condition of what is a refugee. It's not anyone political, it's someone who's essentially in exile, displaced, stateless, nowhere to go, and is just at the mercy of humanitarian actors. She wrote a book, Origins of Totalitarianism, and I think the problematic is very important, especially because of what we're witnessing today. So she said the problem of refugees is that they're essentially the exception to the rule of a nation state system. The problem is that there's fewer and fewer people who fit that nation state system, and many, many more people who don't. And so even at that time when she was writing, 30% of the roughly 100 million inhabitants in Europe were thought of as an exception to a nation state system. And the problem is, once they're forced out of their homeland, they essentially remain homeless. Once they left their state, they became stateless. Once they've been deprived of human rights, they're rightless. And according to her, the scum of the earth, which is what she felt like as a displaced person. And only regaining full citizenship in a state is what guarantees you human rights, she said. That if you don't have that, you're always at the mercy of the whims of someone. Okay, so This gets us to the convention. So the 1951 Convention for Refugees tried to correct that problem. It was written, though, by states for states. And so I hope by now we all know everyone on this participant probably knows the definition, but a refugee is someone who's been persecuted, you're outside of the country of your nationality, and you're unable or unwilling because of that fear to go home. Most people know the legal definition of a refugee, but even more important that if you are recognized as a refugee, you get a range of rights that come with that recognition that's supposed to enable you to lead an independent life. So the Refugee Convention was designed as an amazing, amazing paradigm. The concept is a world in which people are displaced cause worldwide instability. They knew that. So the problem was you want people somewhere so that they could lead an independent life. So the concept was that you equip refugees with a whole bunch of rights so they would not be a burden when they enter a state. States would have never signed it if it wasn't. So, and that's what this slide is showing you. This is a memorandum by the Secretary General that talks about them leading an independent life. There wasn't supposed to be anyone maintained by humanitarian actors, and they're supposed to be integrated in an economic system. Beyond the Refugee Convention, there's a bunch of regional frameworks. So regions said, well, we have our own particular problems. And so they actually have expanded the concept of who is a refugee beyond the more limited definition of persecution. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there's the African or OAU Convention. They expanded. There's the Americas. It's a declaration. So a convention as a force of law, a declaration is not legally binding, but these have all expanded it. In Europe, there's a Charter of Fundamental Rights, which didn't expand the definition, but you'll notice that in the MENA region and in the Asian Pacific region, there's no formal framework. They're outside of the Refugee Convention system. That's going to be important for us to consider in a moment. So this is just showing you that the human rights system is pretty complicated, but there's all sorts of an overlapping framework of rights that are supposed to be protecting forced migrants and refugees, not just the Refugee Convention. There's human rights law, there's prohibitions of torture, there's humanitarian law, and the law of war, which we don't have time to talk about today, but it's important to consider. More relevant to our conversation today is when we're thinking about displaced persons, there's really just three options to consider. You could either get people to go home voluntarily, you could locally integrate them where they are in the country that they arrive to, or if that's not working out, you could resettle them to a third country. And that's the three durable solutions that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and works to try to get the international community and states to sign on to. But it depends on international cooperation. And so I think some of your readings this week especially were trying to point out that it's hard to get international cooperation. And so it's important to think about, well, when and why has it worked? So let's think about the problems of refugee protection in terms of when and why. Like, we don't seem to have international cooperation today. Instead, what we have is a number of problems. One, we have a politics of containment. So today, countries are saying no. That universal declaration of people can enjoy asylum and you have a right to flee, that's all great, but countries aren't letting anyone in. So countries are more interested in migration management. They view that as criminalization of movement. Therefore, instead of even refugee camps, you still have those, you still have urban centers, but you have a rise of transit cities today. Places that were never intended, they were spaces along the route to get to a place of safety, have now become sites for local integration, potentially. You have those transit cities saying we can't handle it, so they're repatriating, meaning that they're sending people back to their country of origin. People can't stay in their country of origin, so they're going out again, and the cycle goes on and on. The Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact for Refugees as the most recent attempt to try to generate international cooperation to break this cycle. The second problem that you need to consider is rights-based refugee protection. The system of the paradigm that I just talked about, the post-World War II paradigm, is a rights-based refugee protection system. And this is a picture that shows you who signed on. So all the countries in green are the countries who are part of that rights-based protection system, and the United States is orange because it only signed the 1967 protocol. But essentially, those are the countries that have bought in. They say, we're all parts of the rights-based protection system. So if a refugee comes into our country, we've signed on, and it has legal teeth to have to give refugees those rights and ultimately a path to citizenship. So the countries in the green, since they've signed on to that, unfortunately, they don't want anyone to come in, because when they come in, they've signed on to the rights. So most of the refugees in the world today are in the red countries, the countries that have not signed on to protecting anybody's rights. And that's where humanitarian work happens. And I imagine many of you on this call, on this webinar today, are operating in that space. So you're operating in a space where you're looking to design solutions, given the fact that refugees are not arriving in states where they're going to be accorded rights. What does refugee protection look like in the countries that are not part of the convention framework? So this is from the field guide for NGOs about protecting refugees, and rights still apply. So this is from the field guide, and it says the phrase international protection covers the gamut of activities through which refugees' rights are secured. So this is a rights-based system. If you look at the International Committee of the Red Cross, it's also based in ensuring respect for the rights of individuals. The Active Learning Network, which I think if you're interested in, you can go and have a look at that, is about accountability and performance in humanitarian action, is also about understanding that humanitarian work is about ensuring respect for humanitarian and human rights norms as it is about giving aid. So it's all about thinking about rights-based protection. The same about the UNHCR's working definition of protection, and I can share these slides. I don't think I need to go through this. The point is just to show you that all over it, the talk is about rights-based refugee protection. But in practice, what we see is not so much rights-based protection, and that's the problem. What mostly we see is humanitarian relief. These two photos are from my work in Nakivale settlement in 2012, at the time when Rwandan refugees who are living in Nakivale were told that they had to go back to Rwanda, but they were still afraid. So protection is what we were doing in the camp by helping people understand their rights. So there we're doing a Know Your Rights campaign so people can make a decision whether or not to go back. The other picture is showing outside where we were doing that rights relief. And so that's a food drop-off, and people would come there and take their bags of food and go back. So humanitarian relief is about addressing people's needs. One of my mentors and one of my really close friends who passed away recently is Barbara Harold Bond. She was the first, she's an anthropologist, and she was really the first to raise this problem, because as most refugees were not able, even before today, to make it to what we call sometimes the global north, given restrictions, refugees were living out lives in refugee camps within states that granted rights to their own citizens, but treated refugees in camps as if they were somehow outside of the state. And so she went and documented the problem, and she wrote about it in her book, Rights in Exile. She also wrote an article, given her work throughout Africa, Can Humanitarian Work with Refugees Be Humane? And she noticed that what happens when you're operating in that space, when refugee camps, is that charity beneficiaries of human aid operate under a victim approach. So there's asymmetrical power relationships, and what Marcel Mauss calls receiving gifts generates an obligation to reciprocate. What she was trying to get people to see is that people shouldn't be treated as victims or as charity or as a beneficiary of humanitarian aid. They're actually entitled to that aid as a matter of rights under international law. So there's all different organizations and NGOs that operate with that mindset. Asylum Access is one that I've worked with, and they talk about people with rights, not just needs. So refugees are entitled to rights, or displaced persons, in fact, are entitled to rights. All sorts of basic rights. You have a right to seek and enjoy asylum, respect for not being sent back to the country you came from, which is non-refoulement, non-discrimination, a right to freedom of movement, administrative assistance. Those are rights not just for refugees. Those are rights guaranteed by international human rights. And there's additional rights: right to work, right to housing, education, public relief, and assistance they may have access to in a country. And I say may because it turns out that there's a loophole, not in the Refugee Convention, because that's a must. If you're declared a refugee, you must be accorded all those rights. But in developing countries under the other human rights, the international covenants on civil and political rights and economic and social rights, there's a loophole in developing countries, and that's where most refugees are located. So developing countries do not have to grant those rights, which is important to think about in your work. So the issue or the problem that I think we're all grappling with is a rights versus needs, at least for the fact that most refugees are existing and living out in exile in states that are non-signatory to the Refugee Convention, is that in those countries, it's very hard to have a rights discourse. Dalal Stevens did a lot of work in the Middle East, and she talks about the language of rights in the case of Iraqi and Syrian refugees is confusing. So it doesn't actually reflect the reality of assistance on the ground, which is oriented towards needs, but also it creates a bad relationship with the states in the region because they never signed on to those rights protections. So the third problem I'm talking about is this problem of how do you talk about, or how do you design protection in a region where the discussion about rights is problematic. So how do we shift the paradigm? This is a slide that talks about my inspirations. I think that it's not so much about rejecting the post-World War II paradigm, because I think it's been an evolution. So what I see having happened since the 1951 Refugee Convention. So you have that convention, which was already about leading an independent life, meaning how do you enable people to just go about their lives after they've been exiled? Barbara Held Bond gave us the concept, well, people shouldn't be losing their rights. Humanitarianism shouldn't be about losing your rights, especially not in refugee camps or urban areas. Amartya Sen is very helpful, gave us the concept of a capabilities approach, that it's better in development to give people the capabilities than to do something for them. Paul Farmer gave us the concept of accompaniment. Alex Betts talks about enabling environments, which was helpful. Paulo Freire went beyond that though, because the people before were still talking about what the we can do for them. To me, the biggest paradigm shift is when we shifted away from that, and I think Paul Farmer started that, but people like Paulo Freire said, we have to be talking about a mutual process. Hilary Cottam, who I read last summer, talks about radical listening and relational work. So it's not about us doing for them, but how do those of us who view ourselves as an us listen better? How do we develop mutual processes? How do we stop trying to solve other people's problems through theories and just enable people to solve their problems on their own? And I work very closely with Faith Nips. She founded the Forced Migration Upward Mobility Project. And I think that these are all the pathway that are using that kind of approach. I wanted to give you a brief example of the dangers of not using that approach. So I know hopefully you've watched the Alex Betts TED Talk. I had the fortunate opportunity of getting to be on a panel with Paul Collier, which got me to look much more systematically at economic zones in theory and practice, and talk to people like Faith Nibbs, who's interviewed people in those zones. And I called her yesterday, so I have an interview with her from yesterday. So I think in theory, something like an economic zone might make sense. So the theory is that you're going to get governments. So for example, Alex Betts had an idea of, well, the right to work. Work is so core to leading an independent life. So if you get governments to buy into a right to work in a place, remember, that isn't rights respecting. So you have a place that isn't signed on to the convention in the Middle East or in the Asian Pacific, like Thailand. But if somehow you take a swath of land that has been uninhabited and the country doesn't care about, and you grant a right to work, maybe that could be a haven for refugee businesses that can't continue to function at home, and a way for global companies to expand jobs. In this case, it was for Jordanians in the Betts case, but it hasn't exactly worked as intended. And the reality is that when people can work in those zones, they're not getting ahead. They're still living in slums, they're still living precarious lives, and they really just change geographies. The problem is that barriers to obtaining a legal permit to work still persist. Many people take jobs in the Black economy at the risk of deportation, and they forego legal protections. Why? Because they often find the jobs not really interesting that were given to them in that economic zone. And so informal jobs are more interesting, higher paying than the ones offered in the new economic zone. So it's a really complicated problem. And also, while business leaders welcome the deal, mostly they're buying in because they're also trying to employ nationals, because these are developing countries. These are countries with their own economic issues. So what I would want to, as we're heading towards a conclusion here, leave you with is, when you're thinking in your program of how you want to design approaches, what you want to work on as your projects, that you need to be thinking about, or it's important to think about, what is the problem, for example, of economic zones? What is the teaching? So I think an economic zone strived within the convention, the old paradigm of leading an independent life, and also within thinking about a rights-based system, the right to work. I think the piece it was missing is what's below the bar. It was missing the listening component. It was listening the pedagogy of the oppressed component to asking people, what do you want? And how can we, what kind of solutions do you think would work for you? So what is an enabling environment? I was fortunate to be able to work as part of a community-based protection group for one of the panels in 2014 for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees annual consultations with NGOs. So what we wanted to find out, because community-based protection was a new lingo, it was all the rage. Everybody wants to do community-based protection, meaning we want to listen. But we did a survey, and I got to analyze that with a team of students to find out, well, what did people in the sector think when they said we're doing community-based protection work? And what we found is that there's three basic understandings. So some people who are saying they're doing community-based protection work, it's really agency-led protection informed by communities. So I would say that's more maybe what Alex Betts' project was. We go in, we ask some people a survey, we hear their answers, and then we go and design our program. The second is a method used by agencies to engage communities in their own protection. That's, you come in, you pick a bunch of stakeholders, you make sure that you include 3 women, some children, some youth, whoever, so you get voices heard, and then you collaborate together to design it. But the third kind was protective action that originates within and is actually led by communities. And that turned out to be the most successful in designing solutions, when it was a much more hands-off approach. So I think it's important to think about what is an enabling environment, and where are you on that chart? So what does all this mean in practice? I think it means that rights of refugees under international law and assistance activities are both considered. I found this slide very useful. I did not create this. This is from the International Council of Voluntary Agencies, ICVA, and they talk about, in their trainings, thinking about who's responsible and what's the obligation. So if you're just trying to think about how to design a program or what you're trying to do with a problem, think about who's responsible and what's the obligation. And I can share this slide so people can see it. And to conclude, I have an activity that I'll share if people want to do it. But that's really all I have in terms of presentation. I ended up, from all the work I was doing and all the learning I did about the paradigm, founding Compass. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. This is how to reach me. You could reach me either as my Northwestern professor address at galyaB@northwestern.edu. But if you want to get involved with Compass, and I'll tell you about that in a moment, that's galyaB@compasspartnerships.org. If I have another moment, I'll just reshare my screen. Oh. Sorry. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is Compass. So I think Compass was born out of this, trying to take the lessons learned, thinking about a rights-based approach, and thinking about the third version, that people design their own solutions, and how do you do that? And so at Compass, what do? We work directly with refugees as partners. We have a team and ask people what do they want to do with their lives, and then work step by step with people as they design their solutions. And so we're just getting started with a new board, working with people, and please visit our website and join us. Okay, that's it.
Great. Thank you so much for that presentation, Galya. So I think a key takeaway is that while all these theories that people have come up with are super important, it's just as, if not more important, for us to pay attention to the realities and listen to the affected populations and communicate. So for our participants, we've opened the Zoom chat for you guys, so don't hesitate to put your questions there. But for now, I'll just get started with a few of the questions that we have prepared while people are kind of thinking of stuff. So our first question was, what is one thing about your work with migratory populations that you wish the general public knew?
So migratory populations at any specific place or everywhere?
Generally, but if you have a specific area of research that you focus on, or a specific geographical location that you could speak to, that would be great too.
Well, I think that the main thing is the listening. I think that we hear things the way we want to hear them. And I think the communication is key. I think it's really hard. I think everything needs to start with listening. And I think what I've learned is that the more I do listening, then the better I am at what I do. So I think really all I can say is radical listening.
Great. Our next question is, how do you suggest that we advocate for change in a system where people might be resistant to change because they benefit from the way that it currently operates?
Yeah, so that's important. So you said a number of things in your question, right? Because you're assuming a they and an us and other and a them. And so when we talk about, we're normally trying to speak to an audience. And I think that that's the biggest challenge, for me in founding a nonprofit, because immediately, even if my goal is to say, well, I'm going to do pedagogy of the oppressed, and this is all about people, and I want to be out of this, like it's not really about me at all. How do I step out of it is the problem, because immediately it's always about who's the audience, and somehow the world seems to want that to shift to the donors, who don't necessarily know the issues, they don't know the problems, they want to solve problems that don't really exist. And so I think that in order to create the change, you need to somehow design ways in which you can ignore those voices because they're not
Again, listening.
change. And you don't necessarily need, I don't want to say this here, I'm saying in a recording, they're funding. But I think that the problem is that, you know, there are people out there designing the smaller voices, the smaller ways. This is just a great example. I have a colleague, Glenda Garelli. She's done amazing work. And she's in Italy now. She was in Chicago. And so she was just so shocked because you have nonprofits paying for researchers to go try to design apps to help refugees along the journey. She was talking to refugees, so everyone already had done that as a refugee. Like they had apps, they had communication means. So, you know, the problem is that people are trying to, that there's one conversation happening about people that just aren't really on the ground surviving, but they're the ones funding the projects that are happening. And then there's people actually surviving and just going about their own business and trying to get it done. So I think it's pivoting to try to join the people who are already getting the job done. Yeah.
Yeah, we see this with a lot of development issues as well in general. But
I have one
our
more
final
piggyback off of that, actually, Shada, if it's okay. Amanda asked, more and more data is needed to justify programming or policy change. But with refugees and IDPs, it's hard to get consistent data, even organization to organization. What data do you think is needed moving forward, or what mistakes should we aim to not make again?
That's just a great question. You know, I just want to preface it, when I got landed in the Congo, because of colleagues like Will Reno, I could enter as just literally being dropped on the ground. And so nobody knew I was, you know, so I arrived in the Congo and I noticed how many people were there trying to collect data. Then almost every Congolese person was already thought that that's all I wanted. So they already had lined up, I was researching sexual violence and justice, lined up women who would speak with me. What's the data you need? We can bring you whatever you need as long as we can be a partner. So I think that the data gathering for project monitoring and evaluation is hugely problematic. And I think, I don't know if that was implicit in this question, because I think someone who is struggling and surviving and in need will give you any information you need for cost. So I think that that's, you know, that's the challenge we have. There is an organization, a collaboration called PIMS. Are you aware of that? It's the protection, I have to remember what it's called, but they're trying to devise standards and ways for data gathering and protocols. And it's an amazing, I'll look it up and I'll share it with you. I just forgot. It's Protection Information Management System, PIMS, Protection Information Management System. I think that's a good thing to have a look at, because that they all addressing that same kind of issue is how do you gather data and how do you bring it to how do you monitor, do program monitoring and evaluation.
Great. And so that kind of, in a way, ties into a final question that we have, and then we can either open up to other questions here. It looks like we have one more coming in, but something that we're kind of curious about, you know, reflecting the current intra-pandemic, we're not going to be post-pandemic for quite some time, intra-pandemic climate, as we see changes in migratory policies in countries who were part of those initial agreements you talked about that were rights-based. How do you foresee migration policies shifting? Do you think it's going to be hugely influenced by the pandemic? And what sort of consequences do you think we should be prepared for as advocates and practitioners?
Yeah, I mean, so I think we all know, everyone here who's on this already sees that the pandemic has just enabled countries to do what they wanted to do already, which was close borders for a different reason. So I think that though, if we ever do get to a post-pandemic world, whether they would reopen based on the convention framework, I think it's hard to get back what you've lost as laws and regulations are changed. Having said that, I always think of everything as an opportunity. I think that it's, the Global Compact of Migration had some great, is a great platform to work off of. I think civil society has grown, which is amazing. So there's been some shifts. One is that as long as we had a convention framework and people thought it was working, most people didn't bother to know about it. What's the biggest shift I've seen since I started working on this is more people are asking why, more people are interested in knowing and learning, which is amazing. So there's a great opportunity for educating the public and getting many more civil society actors involved, which I think is a huge opportunity. And I do think then that there's a huge opportunity going forward to changing paradigms. We never had as many business interests as interested. We never had as many, we just have a wider coalition of actors. It used to sort of be like, oh, UNHCR is managing this, and so let's all work under them, and that was it. But the game has grown. There's just so many more in the coalition of the willing than there was before. And so I think that new coalition of the willing can create change and can create new a new regime once that there's some space for that.
Yeah, great. So we have one more question here. She asks, you mentioned that developing countries are exempted from providing certain rights. Is there a universal list of who is developed or developing?
That's a great question too. I love these questions. So yeah, so I also want to be clear. So the slide I showed about the developing countries, so that's in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is really important because that's what people need. And developing countries decide that on their own. So because remember, this was a state system. It's a system for states by states. So states are in charge of their own understanding of whether they're developing or not. Having said that, someone, let's say you were in a state like Kenya, and you were denied the right to work, and you could bring a lawsuit. And so it would ultimately be a court, and a court might say, well, you really need it. This is the standard, and you also have a principle of non-discrimination, and you're denying this person the right to work. Can you take that to a court and then argue that you shouldn't have been denied that right is really the question. And then that would be the arbiter of, is this a developing state, and are they really obligated by these standards?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your insight. Needless to say, all of us have learned so much from this, whether it's taking information that was already known and putting it in the context of that paradigm shift, or for those of us who are beginners with this field and with this content, that was a really thorough and I think tangible for all levels presentation about the history of what we're looking at and some of the past and current challenges that we're experiencing. So it looks like, yeah, that's all the questions that we have. So thank you for all of you who participated as well. Or hold on, we have one more. Oh, this came in a different box. We have one more. Amanda asks great questions. So she says, how do you predict global paradigm shifts like impacts of COVID-19 and climate change will in the short and long term impact the industry and the displaced individuals themselves? So you kind of touched on that a little bit with one of the questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's happening in any case, and COVID didn't, has just accelerated this. I mean, in any case, the conservative position was to keep people in the countries of origin. The whole concept is with develop countries. So it's not all, like, it sounds like a great idea, have more development aid in countries so that people don't have to leave. Now that might work for economic migrants. That's not ever going to work for a refugee. So if you're talking about economic migrants, then yes, the idea would be maybe with COVID, well, get resources going in countries, build better resources. But everyone, if you're in migration field, that the more development happens in a country, the more people travel. There's so much development in the United States, and people travel more than any other country. So development in a country just leads to more people wanting to go explore, have higher education experiences in other countries. So I think we're always going to have a mobile world. having said that, so migration, in my mind, you're not going to manage migration. Migration happens. The more you develop countries, the more people have a reason to migrate and move around and need mobility. That's economic migrants. Climate change, aside from COVID, people are going to need to flee. That's not resolved, and I don't know what we're going to do, with the COVID world. How is that going to be addressed? You're still going to have displaced persons trying to reach borders. Borders, if they're blocked, become super problematic. So that's what we're seeing there. And then refugees, the reason I always like to argue that we shouldn't get rid of the Refugee Convention, that actually still has the teeth of law. It is holding up. That's why you see states responding as they do. And that's protecting people who can't ever go home. And so you're gonna want to have that. So I know I kind of like meandered through there, but I think the main changes are that you see more people signing on to, yes, let's develop countries, but it still leads to the same. I don't really think we're getting out of any of the issues. We live in a world that has become more mobile and people want to be on the move. COVID isn't necessarily going to change any of that. To me, the biggest thing that you should study in your program is the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis, because that was a time when the world came together in order to produce a cooperative agreement. And so I think the question you're asking is, in a COVID world, what is the basis for international cooperation?
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so do you have time for 2 more questions? We have a few.
Yeah, I thought we had an hour. I just presented short. I was afraid I'd present too long, and and then I just presented very short.
No, it was perfect. Okay, so we have one question. In getting the voices of affected communities not only represented, but the center of focus in decision-making and policies, how can we go beyond just setting quotas and actually guarantee their meaningful participation?
Well, can I just share? I'm going to share a slide for that because I didn't use this before. But this kind of shows you this was our data. So these are examples. So it's better if you could see the difference. So this is an example. So this is the one that originates. So the community, these were examples the sector, meaning people who are working in humanitarian aid in some capacity, talked about. But there's drawbacks to each. So you want to get people informed. So a community provides shelter, community initiated. So the community could provide its own shelter. They know how to shelter. So you ask, they're just providing their own shelter, and you support them. You give them money to provide for their shelter, if that's what you have, or you give them the tools, or they're like, we're going to build a shelter, give them the tools. Great. You don't critique them. They know their shelter, that they need. Community initiated structured dissemination of self-protection measures, mutual psychological support. So that would be, if you're in psychosocial, people are, they already know how they like to do their psychosocial support. So you're just promoting them maybe by, you just ask, what are your needs, and doing your own. But there's harmful practices that agencies or people identified, because you might be perpetuating stigmatization. For example, early marriage, for example, was a harmful example. So there's all sorts of harmful practices that you still have to think about. They're still affected. Who's an affected population? It just drives it downstream, right? So you have to make sure that you're not harming someone by doing something. And then longer term focus enables culturally sensitive conversations, holding debates, workshops to I don't believe, Barbara Harold Bond, I don't like that it says empower. People empower themselves. So you ask people, how do you want to be? How do you empower? What does it take for you to empower yourself? And then, give it to them. And learning over time what works and what doesn't. So hope that answered. Sorry, I'll stop sharing.
Yeah, excellent. Sorry, I'm trying to find which boxes these are coming into. So Shannon asked, you touched on the problems economic zones face. Do you think that there's anything that can be done to make economic zones more effective for refugees and for the host states?
You're gonna get an answer to that. So I think an economic zone is a third best. I mean, the real issue is that people don't have citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that meaningful citizenship. I mean, so some people flee because they don't have meaningful citizenship, but an economic zone, I think in the virtual world, people could have like virtual businesses. So there's other ideas, right? An economic zone, the problem is it's a bit like a refugee camp. People are already in economic zones. They're in a zone that nobody wanted. It's not arid. The land is bad. You're trying to get businesses to buy in. So I don't think that Alex Betts, it was a great intention and he's a great speaker about it, but it didn't create something that didn't already exist. It's a refugee camp in a different location. I mean, you could always have gotten businesses to invest in refugee camps. The reason they're not doing that is because that's just not it's not a business model. It's not how they're investing. So can you do that? I think that it's entrepreneurship. I mean, I suppose, education, higher education, ask people what they want. And I think the COVID world has enabled an amazing new space in terms of remote education and learning, because before the world wasn't accepting the degrees as much, but now people are. And the problem before with education, higher ed, and refugee camps was, where are you going to work when it's all done? So you get your degree, now what? So now maybe there's more spaces. So I think like a great innovation to do is find more ways to harness the people who have gotten degrees now through remote learning and pay them to do businesses that can operate in remote business models. So to me, the remote business model is like an amazing opportunity.
Yeah. And there's so many cool in our research for putting together the curriculum material. We're going to be looking in week 5 at not just humanitarian actors and think tanks, but also businesses and the for-profit sector that are a part of this paradigm shift. And certainly like that's the social enterprises have been a really big part of just being better at creating that refugee-led, refugee-directed, refugee-centered, inclusive space, more so than some of the other examples, that, especially the ones that Betts gave in his book.
Right, and that's what Compass. So at Compass, that's the idea. The idea is to partner with businesses. People could be trained wherever, and can you work in your chosen career, not a job? Like people want careers, they have dreams and aspirations. What are they? And then how do we innovate?
Absolutely. And an interesting conversation that I actually had with someone in their pre-program interview, not to go off on a huge tangent, but she had talked about making educational material for the communities that are going to be accepting refugees as well. And like, it's kind of that equal exchange, more so than us doing something for you. It's like, well, on our part, there's equal responsibility of how do we learn to integrate people who are coming from a slightly different background than us, and recognizing that when you've experienced some sort of life disruption like this, there needs to be some grace, but we can't make it that keep going in that theme of like, oh, but they need us to give them things and to receive our help. It's how can we meet them where they are, and how can they do the same for us, and move forward with that inclusive mutual exchange.
Right, and that's also the tenets of Compass. So Compass is relational work. Everyone brings some form of knowledge. We need more intercultural understanding, listening, and understanding that people don't integrate into. It's a mutual. Everything gets newly created when people are.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so one of these questions I'm going to save because it's going to be good for a speaker later in the week. So Amanda, again, with the good questions. Amanda asked, news cycles move so quickly. What refugee or migrant movements should we be learning about, and that we are not hearing about and learning about every day?
Wow. I mean, so I follow all of that all the time, and you're right. I mean, I think so. Things are evolving in the Sahel region. So I've been watching that. The Rohingya population, they're still happening. There's still, I mean, all the same, if you look at it, I know, so Syria is always the top because it's so many, but, I think there's new Congolese who fled. I mean, so every day, I get reports, and, I'm not on all over the places, but I think that I think the main thing is not necessarily to need to know about because every refugee flow, I think it's more to understand what are the causes of the refugee flow, why are they crossing the border, and in the place where they've crossed, what are their protection needs? Like, is this going to be a short term or a long term? I think I think it's better if you're trying to prepare yourself to understand refugee flows, to study the Malian crisis, and also to understand, like, back in 2015, like people are fleeing, but then they're not all having, the problem is you might decide on a whole response and that's not what anybody even needed. I mean, they're actually gonna go home or, you know, whatever, versus someone who's never gonna go home, versus where are they gonna go, and the place they got to, is that gonna be a good host state? Is that a hospitable place? Stuff like that.
Great. All right. So we have one more question, and then I think we'll be done on the hour. So this last question is, how is protection currently being mainstream in refugee communities with respect to the current COVID-19 situation associated with social distancing? So how of our protection, my interpretation of that is how is that looking now that we have these issues of social distancing?
In in spaces where, I mean, so and that's what we talked about on a webinar that I did with you. So you can answer that too in terms of this. So, I mean, I'm only going to be speaking on that from, you know, I could speak from the fact of how does it working in a developed country or a place in Europe or the United States. Unfortunately, what that looks like is a lot of people having lost jobs that they had because they were operating in minimum wage jobs. So it's about people who are jobless while trying to support families and that they came with and families back home. So it has ripples effects. And then in spaces where people are in transit, it's looking like some of those spaces, like I study Agadez, which is the route across before you start crossing the Sahara and you would have gotten to Morocco, Libya. Spaces like that, they're not necessarily having so much of a COVID threat, but it's more about being stuck and having no employment opportunity. And then, of course, there's a situation where you're stuck in refugee camps or urban centers of transit. And that's a very dangerous situation. And it continues to be, and all the time there's reports about some people being let out or countries saying, oh, we're gonna take people out of here and put them someplace else and relocate them. Unfortunately, I think it's also leading to more repatriation of people back home, which is terrible, as the only country that will take them. And then for the people who are unfortunate enough to stay there, there's just all the mirage that Maddie knows as well as I do, or better, of the not being able to have clean water and not being able to socially distance, and knowing and being just mentally in more desperate state because knowing that your solutions that you might have thought where you were going to have died out.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely the return of asylum seekers has been something that's really troubling for us in Greece lately, especially that Greece has that unique situation of having the pressure of withholding the asylum process of the entire European Union basically at their borders. There's very few other countries that are taking in the volume of new arrivals that they are. And so they've kind of resorted to, there's this immense amount of pressure from the international community to decongest those camps. And one of the solutions has been restricting their asylum processes, making it harder for people to access them in the first place so that that return is easier. But nowadays they're calling it readmittance. But it's essentially, yeah, you're returning them, deporting them, however they see that. That's been a huge issue, and also placing people in closed detention camps to restrict movement with illegal smuggler pathways has also been a really big problem that we've been grappling with as well. And all of that's in the name of COVID. But it's clearly, my theory is the speed at which it all manifested. I'm like, I feel like this was something that you were planning long before, or at least had as an idea long before this happened. And that's been our biggest uphill battle with COVID. In addition to like supply chain interruptions, I'm sure that's something that the globe is feeling right now, is that interruption of supply chain and interruptions in funding as organizations are having to restructure and respond. So yeah, there's been many, not just with social distancing, but lots of consequences from this pandemic. It'll be interesting to see how they play out.
Yeah, I mean, and remember September 11th, when I was already working right in this field, and that again, all those ideas for how to restrict were already in place too. All that September 11th did, they were already written.
Yeah.
It just created the political coalitions to allow it to pass. That's what happens. Every liberal, everyone who I thought was a partner in immigration turned their back. Just September 11th. And you could pass stuff that never, draconian policies that never would have happened, COVID did the same thing. Everything was already in the hopper, and COVID just allowed it. But the bright side of that is it can be won back.
Yes.
It will be won back. So that's what we have to do. Just stay strong and charge forward.
Diligence and good leadership, we can make it happen.
Yes.
Cool. Well, that's a wonderful note to end this on. Thank you so much. Shada, do you have any closing thoughts at all?
No, just thank you so much for a great presentation. I think it really helped for especially the first week setting the tone and sort of breaking everything down for people from all different backgrounds to really kind of be able to grasp and move forward with our program.
Good luck with your program. I wish I could have
Thank
seen
you.
all the participant faces, but I know you're in good hands, and have a great, I just think it's great. I'm really happy that you're all interested and engaged.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.